Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, I will just go through some housekeeping. First of all, welcome. Thanks for joining this discussion about the release of the Well Stimulation Committee's Surface Operation Industry Guidelines. The purpose of this webinar is to have a casual discussion regarding those guidelines and the value of the guidelines, what's in the guidelines, and how we put them together. Um, so before we get started, first of all, I'm Tim Tarpley, President of Energy Workforce and Technology Council. For those of you who are not familiar with the association, we are the National Association for Energy Services and Technology Companies. And one of our committees is the Well Stimulation Committee, which put together this document. Today, as part of our discussions, we're really lucky to have Ron Gusek, who is President and CEO of Liberty Energy, also the EWTC Vice Chair, and will be the Chairman next year. And he works tirelessly to put together these guidelines. So we really appreciate him joining us here today and working his work on these guidelines. John Hutchison, District Manager from ProFrac Services, also has played a big part in developing these guidelines. So we're really lucky to have him here today as well. So panelists, thank you for joining today. What we plan to do is go through some questions with the panelists, and then towards the end we'll have a question and answer period where they'll be able to answer questions from the audience as well. So before we get started with the questions, everyone should know that the council always works with antitrust guidelines. Since we have multiple competitors on the line, we won't talk about pricing or other proprietary information during this discussion. We'll also stick to the agenda as I described. And we also record this. We're recording this call. We'll use the recording to provide to other folks who weren't able to join. The whole recording will be saved and used by the council. With that, everyone will be muted. And when we get to the question and answer period, I'll open it up and you can come off mute and ask questions then. With all of that being said, I think we will go ahead and get started. Ron, like I mentioned at the top of the discussion, you played a big part in preparing these guidelines. Thanks again for that work. Before we did this project in the US, there really wasn't much for well stimulation as far as guidelines go. What was the original intent you had to put together these guidelines, and kind of what hole was that filling in the sector?
Yeah, good morning, Tim. Great to be here. Thanks so much for putting this on and for having me as a part of it. And thanks to everybody who's joined for listening in on this. I would say that if you thought about our industry every day, there's a large number of combinations of E&P companies and service companies out there working together. Of course, that means it could have a wide range of thoughts around how things happen on location. And so for us, the goal in building this document was really to give the industry a single resource for how surface operations should be handled during well stimulation. We sought as a goal really the idea of pulling together all the best practices that make sure operators and service companies together are speaking the same language when it comes to hazard areas, safety planning, communications on site, things like that.
Great. Thanks, Ron. And how many companies supported this effort, and who all made up the working group that really built this out?
Oh, we had a great team come together. I think there were probably a dozen people or thereabouts from 6 service companies that have worked pretty tirelessly to bring together what I think is a pretty comprehensive document. The companies included Liberty, ProFrac, ProPetro, Step Energy, Evolution Well Services, and NextTier. And so all of those companies part of the Well Stimulation Committee and together worked over I guess the better part of maybe even a couple of years now to bring this together. So a great collaborative effort that had a good cross section of field experience and technical expertise. Obviously, cross section of large and small companies. So I think the final document a good representation of how we all think about what needs to happen on location.
Thanks for that, Ron. and I guess we'll go, John. We'll go to the next question to you. In many service lines, the operators are increasingly asking for standardization and uniformity for procedures and for safety. How do you think, in your work, that these guidelines will help fill that need?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me and working with Ron and in the committee. It really helps to align us and give us consistent talking points with these operators as we're beginning the relationship. So it's a united front with the experts in the field actually writing the policies and procedures, and that's really what with Ron's initiative and EWTC working together, we wanted to get the right people in the right room to make sure that how we manage our safety zones, how we manage our hazard zones, what our expectations are for safe operations on surface operations are aligned so that every operator knows our bare minimum of when we pull up, what to expect from us, and how we can integrate together to drive some safety and efficiency.
Well, and that uniformity is so important, John. So you think this will help really bridge those gaps between the expectations of the operators and the different well stimulation providers?
Yeah, it smooths out some of those differences that we've seen, pulling up to site, depending on what equipment that you're bringing out there, but it's the consistency that we can do. It's repeatable from service company to service company and allows us to have a voice to look back and say, it's not just us recommending this as a service provider, it's EWTC, it's their council, it's their experts that wrote this document. So it really allows each service company to have a voice too, to protect the well-being of their individuals on site.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It is so valuable to have that cross section of the industry and have a trade association to take that input and be kind of a uniform force. Ron, we'll go back to you for a few questions before we get into some of the technical side of things. Ron, how do you see industry-led initiatives such as these guidelines to help with regulatory actions, from both the state and federal level? From your perspective, do you think it's always better for the industry to have guidelines like this in place so that when regulators come to us, we have something to show? What are your thoughts on that regulatory side?
I certainly do, Tim. I think it's absolutely advantageous for the industry to lead from the front. I would say that first of all, you never want to have regulators operating in a vacuum. You never want them to start from a blank piece of paper. I think that inevitably leads to less than optimal outcomes when you think about regulation and policy that will ultimately guide our industry. And so I'm certainly of the strong opinion that we are going to benefit by being out in front of that, by having a framework that demonstrates, first of all, we are absolutely committed to executing at the highest level from a safety and operations standpoint, and then B, providing that framework to them upon which they could build regulation and policy. If you can do that, you end up with ideally a regulatory framework that's well aligned with how the industry thinks about its ability to execute, that's well aligned with our capabilities, expertise, best available technology that we can put in the field. So I think there's an awful lot of wins that come from that. I think it also helps to build trust with the regulators. I think if they can look at industry and see that we are being proactive about safety practices, about operational practices, about deployment of next generation technology. If we can show all of those things to them, I think that builds a stronger relationship that has or puts us in a better place to be able to work closely with them as we think about that next set of policies or regulations that are going to come down the pike. So I think there is a lot of benefit to being out in front of that, and I think we've seen that in the places where we've been able to do that.
So that kind of leads into the next question, Ron. So you're obviously familiar with operations, on the U.S. side and up in Canada on the Canadian side of the border. There has been some well stimulation guidelines in Canada. How have you seen those guidelines work with industry? In fact, we used some of those as a baseline for this project. How have you seen those work in practice, and how do you hope maybe some of the positives from those guidelines and the way they work in Canada could be used down here on the U.S. side?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of real positives from that, and certainly in Alberta, which is kind of where I grew up in the industry. The industry in Alberta has been leaning on the what they call IRPs, industry recommended practices, for more than a few decades now. And so I don't know how many there are, maybe 30 or mid 30s industry recommended practices in Alberta. And what we've seen there is a willingness on behalf of the regulator to allow the industry to self-regulate through those IRPs as long as they continue to demonstrate that they are proactive about that they're out in front of the latest in technology, the latest in safety practices and things like that. And so those IRPs bridge everything from drilling through completions and production. Occasionally, we've had the regulator come to us, for example, when hydraulic fracturing on pad locations started to become a big deal, and it was early days, and we were starting to see interference, one well, a frac from one well intersecting another well, and the regulator came to the industry and said, "Look, we see this becoming a common occurrence. We need some best practices around this," and would encourage the industry to go first. And so we did. And that ultimately meant that the regulator didn't feel they had to step in and put unnecessary policy or regulation there. So I think we have a great practice of that in Alberta. I'd love to see that extend to the US and become kind of commonplace here, where the industry, by demonstration of our willingness to be a leader in this, to be innovative and committed to continuing to evolve these practices, to change them and update them as our industry continues to evolve. I think that would be a fantastic model. We've been a little backwards here, and certainly in some places we operate as Liberty. You see the regulator coming first and industry following behind, and I think we got to get that model switched around. This is a great first step in that regard that I think we can hold up as an example of possibilities going forward.
Thanks for that, Ron. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the nuts and bolts, the technical elements of these guidelines. John, I know you were, acutely active in the creation of this document and are knowledgeable about some of the technical areas. Just thought we could go through a couple questions on the technical side with you now. Let's start with the active operations areas section. How are companies working hand in hand with operators to ensure these areas are clearly defined, and talk a little bit about how that's related to the guidelines?
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of the relationship that matters the most. When we get out there, how are we going to perform? How do we expect to perform efficiently and maintain the safety of our individuals on site? You look at concurrent operations that you have. We have a large section of concurrent operations. You're seeing more wells stimulated at a time. You're seeing more wells drilled in one location. You're seeing more concurrent operations from day to day. So we really wanted to get out in front of there from those concurrent operations and say, here's our hazard areas. Here's the evolution of the industry right now. Here's the innovation. We didn't want to put out a document that, in the last 10 years, we would have missed innovation completely in that. So when we're sitting down hand in hand, and it allows our organizations to prioritize those work zones, the hazard zones, the concurrent operations, and to be aware of other people's their hazard zones as well, and have the most informed people writing that policy.
Thanks for that. Moving on to high pressure areas, how have we seen the work in those areas change with increased technology and innovation? I mean, certainly this is a sector that is rapidly evolving technology. What changes have you seen, and you can talk a little bit about how the guidelines address those?
Yeah, I think most service companies have always put in place, in the past decade, we have had a tremendous shift of what's your restricted zone? What's your authorized zone? Where are your top hazard areas, and how are you aligning those? With this document, it allows us to engage that high pressure zone, define it as an industry, what we expect to see in those. And some of that is, we went to a monoline model, the majority of customers. So what you saw is the standardization of how many less connection points and failure points can we get from one side of location to the wellhead. And that allows us for better practices there. Restricting the zone and limiting access to it allows it to be less hazardous to our individuals, our employees, and everyone working around us. So we're not only providing a safe product for our employees, but everyone around us, to abide by those policies. And, we look at, emergency response plans and hazard management. Those are day one things that we want to set up on site. So walking hand in hand with these operators to be able to provide that allows us to, look at the automation that we have. There's hydraulic over and electronic PRV systems that people are using. We're using remote viewing in the safety zones to restrict that access and make sure that we still understand what's going on in there. High pressure componentry has changed from the evolution from iron to high pressure hoses. So when you change all this innovation, put all this technology together, we have to still be able to manage it. We have to still associate the risk and provide what we're doing to reduce the risk. This document just showcases that here is what we provide in those areas to maintain the safety of your well site.
Thanks for that. And that kind of leads to, elevated work zones. Can you talk a little bit about the development of, addressing those areas in these guidelines, and what was the working groups thinking behind going that direction?
Yeah, this was largely innovative with some of the technology that we see in the sector. Conventionally, it was diesel equipment that we would drag out to location. Now you have electric fleets. Now you have biofuel fleets. Now you have hybrid fleets. You have a lot more elevated work in hazard areas that weren't clearly defined by the industry, weren't clearly defined by regulators. There's parameters set by each of the safety regulators that we have, whether it's OSHA, MSHA. But we wanted to get ahead of it, like Ron was saying, to define it for ourselves and showcase what we're doing to protect those areas. And, it allows companies that are reading this, or EMPs that are reading this, that here's our minimum standard for excellence. We're all going to have different innovation around this, but this is our minimum standard for what we provide when we come to your site.
And, speaking of particular areas like electrical hazard zones, natural gas areas, and wireline areas, are there particular safety considerations that, you've seen that companies should really be paying extra attention to in those regions, in those areas?
Yeah, that, when you look at electrical hazard or natural gas hazards, those are hazards unseen for the most part. If you see them, they're very catastrophic. So when we're looking at it from that risk assessment point of view. What do we need to do to minimize our risk to our employees? What do we need to do to make sure that we can pump efficiently? What do we need to make sure that well gets completed efficiently? And that's the standardization of these hazard zones. If we're looking at electrical hazard zones, we're looking at arc flashes, we're looking at studies, we're looking at acquired knowledge. And some of this is some of the tribal knowledge that all these companies have worked with EWTC that's never been written down before. So we wanted to capture that as technology and innovation is hitting the market rather than be behind the eight ball. And like Ron said, if our regulators are able to read this, it only benefits us having a united front of what we provide.
Thanks for that answer. So specifically on emergency shutdown devices, what is required? I know we discussed those in the guidelines, and why were we recommending those in specific areas? How do they help ensure safe operations?
Yeah, I think that the emergency shutdown is more than just the devices. It's the hazard recognition of the zones. It's making sure that those zones are recognized by everyone, that there's a emergency plan involved with every time that you come to a different site, every time you're mobilizing, every time that you're coming to that plan is communicated to the operator and dealt with. As far as specific ESDs, we're requiring an ESD to prevent natural gas failure. If there's biofuel being used, CNG being used, LNG being used, we want to ensure that that's safe operation. So we're requiring an ESD of some combination that whoever the service company or operator wants to provide, because that's sight unseen. Those are things that you can't see. You can read whatever metric we want to, whether it's volume or flow, but we can't see the natural gas. So that's a hazard that's becoming very prevalent in the industry. The other thing would be the electrical zones. Everything's evolving with it. And there's a lot of changes to putting an electrician in the work zones that we have. The electrical work zones go over the hazard zones that we have, a high pressure area, restricted work zones throughout this. So we wanted to inform everyone with our innovation and those specific ESDs is let's shut this down and ensure that our people are safe, that our equipment's safe, and that the operators can have a consistent result. And if there is anything outside there, we're making sure that we're taking ownership of the safety of our equipment and our people, and we're able to track that, and we're able to repeat that, and we're able to showcase, we're ahead of the curve in safety, and this is what we provide for our team and for your well sites.
Well, thanks for that. Well, we've kind of gone through the basics to the guidelines, and I think one of the most interesting things we can do is at this point is open up to the audience for some questions. We've got two knowledgeable folks here that were very involved in the creation of these guidelines. So let's go ahead and see if there's any questions from the audience. You can either just take yourself off mute and ask a question, or if you want to raise your hand, just pop it in the pop up your hand there, and we'll call on you. But let's pause now and see if there's any questions from the audience. Everyone is being shy. No questions for the group?
Okay. Yeah, I'll ask one to Ron if nobody's going to ask one. Ron,
get us going here. Get us going here, John.
Where do you see us evolving next steps, Ron?
Oh, that's a good question. I certainly think we've got lots of opportunities there. Of course, we got to start on a first chapter really just focused on surface use of natural gas and that role in our world. Now we've got the surface operations piece, but I think there's a lot of additional opportunities that we could be looking at, and so I think there's more than a few chapters to come down the road yet. I would certainly say to anybody on the call, if you're interested in being a part of standards development, if you have some thoughts around where you'd like to see a consistent standard across the industry, we're absolutely open to that. But I think we've got a number of ideas in the committee right now, and going to be working our way through those chapters one by one. But ultimately, I think we're going to end up with a pretty cohesive document that represents the completion operation on location from start to finish and every aspect of it that we touch now. So looking forward to the coming years and the additional work that's going to happen there.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Ron. There's more to go, and I think this is one chapter in what will ultimately be a series of industry best practices for well stimulation. We're working on forming our new gas handling group that is going to take on that next project. And so we can keep moving these forward as time goes forward. I think it's a valuable thing we can do as a trade association. I think it's a valuable thing that the companies can do, to put their time into. Any other questions from the audience?
Hello, Jason Archuleta from E3. My question is, what feedback have we received from the operator pool in terms of the standards that are set? Any feedback from the operators?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Tim, maybe you can provide some feedback as well. But certainly, I think quite positive. I think what we're seeing from the operators, and obviously going to vary operator by operator. You've maybe got some smaller ones who probably have less ability to build standards internally, all the way to those very large operators that have some relatively comprehensive expectations on location today. So I think you're going to see it vary a little, but the feedback we've had to this point in time has been very positive on the work we're doing, and I think that's true across the board. I do think there's a real desire on behalf of our customers to see these sorts of standards built, to get to a place where they can expect a standard of delivery regardless of who comes out to do that work. You'll notice when you look through the document, I think we've done a really good job of trying to make this set a baseline of expectations that works for all the service providers, regardless of what kind of location you're on, the size of the E&P you're working for, even the size of your own operation. You'll see the document broke into a series of should and shall statements. Should, where we think this is an absolute must, or a shall, sorry, where we think that's an absolute must, and a should, where it's a recommendation. So I think we've built enough flexibility in there that it's going to work pretty comprehensively across the board, regardless of size of service company, size of E&P company, or the type of job that you're out doing. And as a result, I think some real positive reception around that. We were talking before we let everybody on the call, just around what next steps are there, maybe even around training and ensuring that not only do we provide these sorts of updates to the service community, but how it is that we best educate the E&P community around these standards, the availability of them, and encourage adoption of them, so that we as the service industry also benefit from a very consistent expectation on location. I think we're all challenged when it comes to delivering efficient operations. If every location that you go to has a different set of expectations, imagine how simple our world could be if that expectation was very consistent from location to location to location, that if you acknowledge as a service company you're going to meet those standards, that you check the box for the E&P company you're going to work for, rather than having that unique set of requirements on every location. So I think there's a lot of upside there. We've got some work in front of us, but feedback's been positive so far. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Tim, from what you've heard.
I do, Ron, and I mean, I think just to bolster on what you said, I think you made a lot of good points. So as a trade association, EWTC, we represent multiple service lines, well stimulation, well servicing, wireline, general services, the manufacturers. In all those different sectors, we are hearing a desire from the operators for guidelines, for more guidelines, as well as trainings. On the well servicing side, we've built out guidelines many years ago, and those have now turned into a certification program, a training program, and a certification program. We're being asked by the operators to do more of those. So I think it's the same for well stimulation. I think this is the first step, is getting these guidelines together, and then as we build that out, we could look at growth. But in all of our conversations with the operators, we're being asked to do more of this, and they're asking our companies to do more of this. So we think it's a response to really what the market demands. And then we talked a little bit about it earlier at the top of the hour. I really think from a regulatory standpoint, it is so vital to have these industry guidelines that are built by the industry and have them in place. The last thing you want to have is an instance where regulators, either at the state or federal level, are coming to the industry or coming to the trade associations, and they're saying, okay, what is the industry standard? What are the guidelines? And then you don't have anything to show. So I think we're being proactive. I think we're being smart as an industry, as a sector of the industry. And I think this is really valuable, and it's better to do it now than wait until later when maybe we have to do it. We're asked to do it. So I think for those two reasons, it's a really valuable effort that these folks have put their time and effort into. Any other questions from the group? Just come off mute or raise your hand, either one. Okay. Well, we will do one last call here, and unless there are any final questions, we will go ahead and wrap. We really appreciate everybody joining. I don't see any hands. Last call, going once, going twice. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to our panelists. There's a lot of content to go through. We appreciate y'all's work putting these together, and we appreciate you giving us the time today to have this conversation. Thanks everybody for joining.